It was a calm Thursday afternoon when Judge Robert Harrison, a man known for his stern approach to law, donned his badge and headed out for his voluntary shift as a traffic court officer. Harrison had been a judge for over 2 decades, and while his official duties were in the courtroom, he often chose to take on small roles like this in the community, perhaps as a way to connect with the public, or maybe just to reinforce his belief that the law should be applied equally to everyone. He had seen it all before: speeders, people running red lights, distracted drivers, those who thought they were above the rules. But today, it felt like any other afternoon. The sun was shining, traffic was light, and he was stationed near a quiet intersection in the heart of the city. His routine was simple: watch for violations, pull over anyone breaking the law, issue a citation, and move on to the next. That was when he saw her. A sleek black car rolled through a stop sign at the corner of Maple and Fifth. It wasn't a blatant run through the intersection, but it was clear that the driver hadn't come to a full stop. Harrison's instincts kicked in. He turned on his siren and pulled the car over, not thinking twice about the nature of the violation. His mindset was simple: the law must be upheld, no matter who was behind the wheel. The car rolled to a stop in front of him, and the driver, a black woman dressed in an elegant but professional outfit, put the car in park. She didn't seem flustered, just calm, composed, and unbothered by the encounter. She glanced in her rearview mirror as Harrison approached her window. "Good afternoon, ma'am," Harrison said as he leaned toward her window. "I pulled you over for a rolling stop back there at the intersection. Can I see your driver's license and registration?" The woman nodded, her voice steady as she replied, "Of course," reaching for the documents in the glove compartment. Harrison studied her for a moment. She appeared well put together, no obvious signs of stress or tension. That seemed unusual for someone who had just been stopped. He'd dealt with his fair share of irritated drivers, but she remained entirely calm. Maybe it was just nerves, but she didn't seem to be the type to get riled up easily. "I'll just be a moment," Harrison said, turning away from the window to process her information. As he did, a fleeting thought crossed his mind. She was dressed in such a professional manner. Was she someone important? A lawyer? A businesswoman? But before he could dwell on it further, he shook the thought away. It didn't matter. The law was the law. A few moments later, Harrison returned with the citation in hand. "I'm issuing a fine for the violation," he said, handing it to her without much fanfare. "Please make sure to be more careful next time." The woman took the ticket, nodded politely, and without offering any explanation, simply said, "Thank you," before rolling up her window. She drove off without a word of protest, her demeanor as graceful as when she had first arrived. Harrison watched her car disappear into the distance, thinking to himself that it had been just another routine stop. Little did he know, that would be the last time he'd ever see the woman in such a light. As the afternoon stretched on, Judge Harrison's attention shifted back to the task at hand. He had a job to do, and the day wasn't over. Another car sped past him, but he didn't hesitate. He reached for his radar gun, pulled out onto the street, and began scanning for further violations. It was almost as if the brief encounter with the well-dressed woman had been a passing blur, nothing more than a footnote in his day. However, as the hours passed and the day wound down, something began to gnaw at him. The woman's composure lingered in his mind, a quiet reminder that not everyone reacted the way most drivers did when they were stopped. He found himself replaying the interaction over and over in his mind, not because he felt guilty, but because something about her calmness had unsettled him. It wasn't like the defensive or confrontational reactions he usually dealt with. Still, Harrison shrugged off the feeling. He was a judge after all. His role wasn't to question, it was to enforce the law. There was no need to dwell on it. Besides, it wasn't as if he had done anything wrong. She had rolled through the stop sign, and he'd followed protocol. A simple citation. Case closed. At home that evening, Harrison settled into his chair with a glass of whiskey, trying to unwind after the long day. He didn't have much time for distractions. Tomorrow was another busy day at the courthouse, and his docket was packed. He needed rest. But then his phone buzzed. It was a news notification. Curious, Harrison unlocked his phone and scrolled through the headline. His eyes narrowed in disbelief. The woman he had stopped, was she really who he thought she was? The headline read, "Local Supreme Court Justice pulled over for minor traffic violation." His pulse quickened. Harrison clicked the link, scanning the article quickly. As he read, a wave of realization hit him, the weight of it sinking in with full force. The woman he had issued a citation to, the one who had seemed so unassuming, was indeed the same person. The name printed in the article matched exactly with the woman he had found just hours earlier. It was her. Judge Robert Harrison sat back in his chair, staring at the screen. He knew who she was. He'd seen her in the news countless times. She had been a trailblazer, an advocate for justice, someone who had shaped critical rulings that had impacted not just the state, but the entire nation. The more he read, the more his stomach sank. How had he not recognized her? She wasn't just any random person. She was a Supreme Court justice. Harrison's mind raced. Could it be that his own biases had led him to overlook something as obvious as her status? How had he been so blind? Had he been too quick to assume she was just another driver in need of a fine? He tried to shake off the guilt, but it lingered like an uncomfortable wave on his chest. The story didn't stop there. The article was already circulating, and the public was starting to talk. What did this mean for him now? How would his colleagues react? And worse, how would the justice herself respond? The news spread quickly. By the following morning, Judge Robert Harrison found himself the subject of countless conversations. At the courthouse, in coffee shops, and even at the local gym. The story of the Supreme Court justice getting fined for a minor traffic violation was everywhere. What had seemed like an ordinary, inconsequential event had turned into a media frenzy, with people questioning the judge's actions and discussing what it meant for the state of justice itself. Harrison's phone had been ringing nonstop since he woke up, and each call made his stomach tighten. He felt trapped in the spotlight he never asked for, but couldn't escape. His colleagues had called to express their surprise, some even congratulating him for doing his job, others expressing concern about how the situation might affect the public's view of the judicial system. He sat at his desk, staring at the headlines that now dominated the local news. Supreme Court Justice fined by local judge for minor traffic violation. The words felt heavy, like a label that had been slapped onto his reputation. The more Harrison thought about the situation, the more he realized just how little he knew about the woman he fined. She was a respected figure in legal circles, someone with decades of experience and a long history of groundbreaking decisions. And yet, when she stood in front of him, she was just another driver, a fact that seemed so painfully ordinary in hindsight. She had never identified herself as a Supreme Court justice. Why would she? It hadn't even crossed his mind that she might be someone important. She wasn't wearing robes. There was no press conference, no entourage. She was just a person like anyone else, navigating the same streets he did. Harrison had been so focused on the law, on issuing the citation without hesitation, that he hadn't considered the possibility that this ordinary person might be someone with an extraordinary role in the justice system. As the day wore on, the story began to evolve. The media buzzed with different angles. Some people defended the judge, arguing that the law was the law and everyone should be treated equally, while others questioned whether his lack of recognition was indicative of a larger problem in how the system operated. How had the judge not known who she was? Was this an example of unconscious bias at play? Meanwhile, the woman, the Supreme Court justice, remained silent. She hadn't commented on the fine or the ensuing controversy. Her refusal to speak made headlines too, as people speculated about her thoughts on the matter. Some wondered if she was offended. Others questioned whether she would seek legal action against the judge. But she said nothing. For Harrison, the silence was deafening. Her calm, collected demeanor during the traffic stop made it clear she wasn't interested in creating a spectacle. Yet, as he sat there, reading through all the articles, he felt the weight of her unspoken words. She had become a symbol of something bigger, something he couldn't ignore. It was then that Harrison realized that the consequences of this moment went far beyond the fine he had issued. The situation had revealed something deeply unsettling about how he viewed the world, and more importantly, how the world viewed him. The following morning, Judge Harrison couldn't escape the wave of attention. Every interaction seemed to circle back to the incident. News outlets, social media, and even casual conversations around town were consumed by the story of the Supreme Court justice receiving a ticket for a traffic violation. The comments ranged from supportive to critical, but one thing was clear: Harrison's role in this drama was far from over. As the day went on, Harrison's discomfort grew. His colleagues at the courthouse, though supportive in their own ways, couldn't stop asking him how it had happened. "How did you not recognize her?" one of his fellow judges asked. "She's everywhere in the news." Harrison had no good answer. In truth, he had never considered the woman in front of him as anything more than just a driver in violation of the law. His whole life had been governed by a strict adherence to the rules, but now he was grappling with an unsettling truth. He had made an unconscious assumption based on her appearance and demeanor, failing to see beyond the surface. The more he thought about it, the more his guilt festered. In the midst of his self-reflection, the media frenzy reached its peak. News organizations, both local and national, covered the story from every angle. They had already dug deep into the details of the Supreme Court justice's background, her decades of service, her pivotal role in landmark cases, and her status as a champion of civil rights. Her name, once simply associated with legal expertise, now took on an entirely new significance in the context of this incident. But what really caught Harrison off guard was an interview with the justice herself. She had finally broken her silence, but in a way that was calm and dignified. No anger, no defensiveness, just a quiet response that resonated with the public. She addressed the incident without fanfare, stating simply, "The law is for everyone, regardless of who they are. I respect the judge's duty, and I understand why he did what he did." There it was, laid bare in front of him. She hadn't felt personally affronted, nor had she attempted to make a spectacle out of the situation. Her response was measured, composed, and, above all, humbling. Harrison felt a wave of relief mixed with shame. Her ability to handle the situation with such grace only highlighted the contrast between her level-headed response and his own internal chaos. But there was more. The justice had subtly reminded everyone of the bigger picture, the importance of the law, the equality it was meant to uphold, and the role of those who enforce it. By not reacting, by choosing not to escalate the issue, she had forced Harrison to face something deeper: his own biases, assumptions, and the way he viewed people in positions of power. Harrison stared at the screen, reading and rereading her statement. Her words were calm, but they stung. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. This moment wasn't just about a ticket or a fine. It was about seeing people, not as categories or roles, but as human beings. It was about understanding the weight of every action, especially when those in power are the ones tasked with upholding justice. As Harrison sat in his office, the walls suddenly felt closer. His mind raced, unsure of what to do next. Should he reach out to her, apologize? Or would it all feel too late, too disconnected? He knew one thing for sure: he had to change the way he saw the world, starting with himself. In the days that followed, Judge Harrison became consumed by the weight of his actions. He could no longer ignore the deep discomfort that had settled in his chest. His interactions with colleagues and the public began to feel strained, as if everyone was silently questioning his competence, or worse, his ability to administer justice impartially. The media continued to cover the story, but now the focus was shifting. People were asking deeper questions. How could a judge, a man with years of experience, fail to recognize a Supreme Court justice? Did this reveal something larger about how the justice system operated, especially when it came to race and class? How many other people had Harrison treated similarly, assuming they were less important or less deserving of attention, simply because of how they presented themselves? The questions gnawed at him, making him realize how little he truly understood about the world beyond the narrow confines of his courtroom. It wasn't just the fact that he had failed to recognize the justice, it was the assumption he had made when she stepped into his view. His unconscious bias had led him to treat her as just another person in a long line of drivers, not considering the possibility that someone so poised and self-assured could hold a position of immense power. He spent the following days replaying every detail of the interaction. He thought about the way she had remained composed and respectful, not once hinting that she was anyone other than a person who had made a small mistake. She had never used her position to avoid a citation, never once tried to leverage her status. She had just accepted it with quiet dignity. And yet, in his mind, she had been like anyone else, no more important than the last person he fined for a similar infraction. The realization that he had missed something so glaring was humbling, and the shame was hard to shake. He was a judge, someone who had prided himself on fairness and equal treatment under the law. But in that moment, he had failed, not just the justice, but the very ideals he claimed to uphold. He had acted without seeing her, without considering that this was a woman who had shaped history, who had fought for justice in ways that he could only hope to understand. The more he reflected, the clearer it became. He had treated her as if she were just another person to be processed through the system, another case number to deal with. It was a painful, eye-opening lesson in privilege, bias, and the way people like him, people in power, could become blind to the world around them. But the hardest part was accepting that this wasn't just about a single mistake. It was a pattern, a way of thinking that had likely colored countless other interactions he had had throughout his career. And that, more than anything, was what needed to change. Finally, Harrison knew what he had to do. It wasn't enough to simply regret the mistake or hope the world would forget. He needed to take action. He needed to make things right, not just for the justice, but for himself and for the system he served. And the first step was reaching out to her. Judge Harrison's decision to reach out to the Supreme Court justice didn't come easily. He had spent days wrestling with his thoughts, battling shame, and confronting his own biases. But deep down, he knew this was a moment of personal accountability, one he couldn't simply sweep under the rug. This wasn't about his reputation. It was about doing the right thing. He had to apologize, not just to her, but to himself for letting his assumptions shape his actions. He drafted the message carefully. He knew the justice had handled the situation with quiet grace, and he wanted his apology to reflect that same respect. It had to be sincere, thoughtful, and most importantly, humble. The last thing he wanted was to appear insincere or defensive. "Dear Justice Williams," the message began, "I hope this message finds you well. I am writing to express my deepest apologies for the way I handled our recent encounter. In hindsight, I recognize that I failed to see beyond the surface and treated you as just another driver. I deeply regret my actions and the assumptions I made. You deserved far more respect than I gave you in that moment." He paused for a moment before continuing, thinking carefully about the weight of his words. The law is meant to treat everyone equally, and I let unconscious bias influence my behavior in a way that I can never undo. I have a responsibility to ensure fairness in every interaction, and I failed to live up to that standard with you. Please know that this experience has caused me to reflect deeply, and I am committed to learning from it. Harrison signed his name with a mixture of relief and unease. He didn't know what to expect in return, but the important part was that he had taken the first step. He hit send. As the hours passed, Harrison's mind raced. He knew it was likely that the justice was busy with her own responsibilities and would not immediately respond. And even if she did, he couldn't predict how she would react. Would she accept his apology, or would she see it as too little, too late? To his surprise, her response came much sooner than he expected. "Judge Harrison, the reply began. "Thank you for your message. I appreciate your honesty, and I understand that moments like these can be difficult. I respect your willingness to confront your actions and the reflection that has followed. We all have moments of growth, and this appears to be one of yours." She continued, offering a thoughtful but firm response. "I believe that justice begins with seeing people clearly, not through assumptions or biases, but as individuals. I appreciate the work you do and trust you'll continue to serve with fairness and humility." Her words were calm, dignified, and, in their own way, reassuring. Harrison could almost feel the weight of her experience in her response. She didn't treat him as an adversary. She treated him as someone who was capable of growth. Her ability to forgive, to move past the incident without holding it over him, left him in awe. He sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of her words settle in. It was more than just a professional courtesy. It was an invitation to change, to truly understand what it meant to serve justice. Harrison knew this moment would stay with him, not as a mistake, but as the beginning of a new chapter. The days following the exchange with Justice Williams felt like a quiet turning point for Judge Harrison. Her response to his apology, so thoughtful and gracious, left him with a sense of clarity he hadn't expected. It wasn't just about the fine or the traffic stop anymore. It was about something deeper, about fairness, humility, and seeing people not just for the roles they played in society, but for the full scope of who they were. Harrison found himself questioning everything: his past decisions, his automatic reactions to people, and the subtle ways his own biases might have shaped his judgments over the years. He had spent so much time adhering strictly to the law, convinced that rules alone ensured fairness. But now, he understood that justice was more than just black and white lines on paper. It was about empathy, awareness, and the willingness to see people beyond their outward appearance. He took immediate steps to implement changes in his own life. He began by meeting with a group of local community leaders, asking questions about their experiences with the justice system. What did fairness really look like in practice? Were there ways the system could be more inclusive, more responsive to those who felt overlooked or unfairly treated? He also sought out mentorship from a colleague who had spent years working on civil rights issues. They discussed how implicit biases affected both personal behavior and legal proceedings, and Harrison began to realize how easy it was to fall into the trap of assumptions, especially when dealing with people from different walks of life. It wasn't just about being blind to one's prejudices. It was about actively working to recognize them and confront them head-on. Through these conversations, Harrison slowly began to see how powerful his role truly was and how important it was to use that power responsibly. He no longer wanted to simply be a judge who made decisions from the bench. He wanted to be someone who truly understood the people who came before him. He wanted to be someone who could listen without judgment, who could be aware of his own limitations, and who would approach every case with a deep, unwavering commitment to justice. Meanwhile, the community began to notice a change in Harrison. It was subtle at first. He took more time to listen during trials. He engaged with those who appeared before him with greater patience, and he started attending more events aimed at improving legal access for marginalized communities. His colleagues noticed the shift as well. They saw a judge who was more reflective, more willing to engage in conversations about bias and fairness. Though the media storm had passed, the incident with Justice Williams continued to linger in Harrison's mind as a constant reminder. That moment was not just a personal misstep, but an opportunity for growth. In a way, that single traffic stop had altered the course of his career. It had opened his eyes to the need for continuous self-examination and the understanding that true justice came from seeing others clearly, not through the lens of rank or status, but as human beings deserving of dignity and respect. And as he continued his work, Harrison carried with him the quiet strength of that lesson, knowing that it would stay with him for the rest of his life. Months passed, and the ripple effects of the traffic stop and the subsequent apology began to fade in the public eye. But for Judge Harrison, the experience had fundamentally changed him. He had not only learned the importance of confronting his biases, but also of recognizing the power in those moments where we have the chance to grow. The humility he had gained from the encounter with Justice Williams remained a part of him, shaping every decision he made, both in the courtroom and beyond. Harrison's journey of self-reflection wasn't just internal. It had sparked a broader desire to be more active in reforming the judicial system. He became involved in initiatives that aimed to promote fairness and inclusion, working alongside community groups, legal organizations, and other judges to address systemic issues. These conversations were often difficult, but Harrison welcomed them, knowing that they were necessary for meaningful change. His role as a judge had given him the authority to influence the lives of others, but now he realized that he also had the responsibility to be a catalyst for positive transformation. One of the projects he became particularly passionate about was a program aimed at educating local law enforcement about unconscious bias and its impact on decision-making. Harrison had become acutely aware of how the actions of those in positions of power, whether in the courtroom or on the streets, could deeply affect people's lives. He worked closely with law enforcement agencies to ensure that officers had access to training that would help them recognize their own biases and treat people with more understanding and empathy. Through these efforts, Harrison earned the respect of his peers and the community. His colleagues saw the way he approached every case with newfound care and consideration. He no longer viewed the law as a rigid set of rules that could be enforced blindly. Instead, he understood that justice required a more nuanced understanding of each individual's circumstances. But perhaps the most meaningful change came when he received an unexpected letter months later from Justice Williams herself. It was brief, but it carried the weight of her wisdom. She thanked him for his efforts to address bias within the system and encouraged him to continue down the path of personal and professional growth. "I have no doubt," she wrote, "that you will continue to serve with fairness and integrity, not because you are perfect, but because you are willing to learn. And that, to me, is the essence of true justice." Reading her words, Harrison felt a profound sense of gratitude. The story of the traffic stop, one that had initially felt like a mistake, had turned into an opportunity for something far greater than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just about his own growth, but the ripple effect of that growth in the system he was part of. As he sat back in his office, looking out over the city, Harrison realized that he had finally started to see the world as it was meant to be seen, not through the lens of rank, status, or assumption, but through the lens of true justice, grounded in humility and compassion. And for the first time in his career, he felt like he was truly living out the ideals he had once only preached.